Oh, guys, we have 18 viewers so far. Oh, crap, can you hear me?
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Um, welcome tonight to our panel discussion to what does it mean to move beyond policing. My name is Zelly Thomas, and I'm one of the organizers for Black Lives Matter Paterson. Black Lives Matter Paterson is a Black youth-led organization whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. By combating and counteracting acts of violence, creating space for Black imagination and innovation, and centering Black joy, we are winning immediate improvements in our lives. Panel discussions like these are part of this work. I want to begin by grounding ourselves in a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and stolen territories across which we are learning, working, and organizing today. This includes the land of the Nanticoke Lenape people of the Algonquin Nation of the land, also known as New Jersey. We seek to be in solidarity with these nations and other indigenous communities in their most pressing struggles. As we recognize the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on communities of color and those living in poverty, we recognize that if the Native American tribal lands were treated as states, the 5 most infected states in the US will all be tribal lands. We take the opportunity to recognize the continued survival of Indigenous peoples, despite systems of global imperialism that have sought to destroy their livelihoods. We encourage all participants to continue to learn about whose land you are on and specific struggles of your local Indigenous communities. And now I want to pass it on to tonight's moderator, Bree.
Okay. Hi, guys. I am Bree. I am one of the organizers for Black Lives Matter Paterson. And tonight we have 5 panelists, and I'm going to introduce them. We have Stacey Alvarez, who is from a New Jersey native, who attended Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Stacey is, in the fall, she'll become the assistant principal of Truth Academy in Newark. She is a fierce advocate for racial equality or equity in education. Stacey, you wanna just weave? Okay. We also have Taji Bounds, I'm sorry. He's a 7th year educator, currently teaching 8th grade social studies in Newark, New Jersey. He is currently pursuing a master's degree in sociology and education with a concentration in education policy at the Teachers College in Columbia. His research interest includes Black studies, critical race theory, and frameworks for culturally responsive and sustaining school leadership and classroom pedagogy. We have Lisa Chowdhury, who is an assistant professor of criminal justice at BMCC CNUI, so CUNY. She is a critical criminologist, and her areas of expertise are intersectionality, mass incarceration, restorative justice, youth and gang and violence interventions. She is the co-founder of Reimagining Justice, Inc., and is a social justice advocate, agent. I'm sorry, I'm reading off this and I'm getting a little tongue twisted. And she's the project director for Passaic County first hospital-based violence intervention program, which is the Paterson Healing Collective, which we did work with over this weekend. That was awesome. And then we have Dr. Williams. Dr. Williams, a criminologist who focuses, yes, he's waving, focuses largely on radicalized social control. He engages on the ground community-based research around issues dealing with the African-American community and policing relations. He has done work in the Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, and in the Newark area here in New Jersey. And then we have Philip McHarris. Wait. Okay. He is a writer. He's incoming Princeton 2021. So you're smart. His main areas of focus include housing, policing, and inequality. His main areas, his current research focuses on the experience of residents of high-rise public housing developments in Brooklyn, New York, as they navigate surrounding safety, policing, building conditions, and cycles of poverty. So tonight we are going to talk about, I have a question. So what is defunding the police and what does that mean to you guys?
I can start off. To me, hi everyone. It's great to be here with everyone. The way I tend to define defunding, so I see it as a part of a broader strategy of invest, divest, and specifically around policing. How I imagine it is to divest from systems of policing as well as systems of punishment more broadly, and to invest in 2 key things. One is community resources, all of the things that we know help keep people safe, things like education, dignified employment, healthcare, housing, and food, and the like. Which creates a context where communities are safer, but then on the other end also investing in alternative emergency response systems for when there are emergencies, making sure people have people to call that don't carry what we know that police come with. And I imagine it in, as others within a broader framework that can be sort of in line with abolitionist organizing. Yeah.
Okay, anyone else? How do you see this? How do you define it in your line of work?
Lisa, go ahead.
Sure. Okay, I'm sorry. So for me, when I hear the words defunding police, it really means a reallocation of resources by investing in human potential. That means for us and the work that we do right now with the Paterson Healing Collective is really redefining what public safety really means. So what we do is we're trying to build the community's capacity of addressing what people are most bothered by, right, which is violence, right? And understanding that there's social determinants of violence, much like what Philip said. You have to think about investing in the resources that the community needs. When we go around in the community, or when we arrive at the bedside of someone who's just become a victim of gun violence, we ask them, what do you need, right? How can we support you? How can we help you? Then when we go out in the community, we ask them, what do you need? How do we build the capacity of this block or this neighborhood so that we can make sure that you're living the best life that you can? So I think that we're at a really integral point in our history where we can really redefine what public safety means and what it looks like. Because many of us are kind of cultured into understanding what public safety looks, and we believe it's in a uniform and a gun. And I think that when we talk about defunding police, we really have to really focus on reallocating resources into investing in those communities that are most impacted by all these different things, whether it's a pandemic or violence or whatever it is, right? Because it's a multitude of issues that are going on in those same locations. And I think that instead of getting all politicized, it's just about doing the right thing, right? Our police budgets are crazy right now, and our education budgets are not. So if we're really talking about what's needed, it's really to get to the root cause of the problem and investing in our communities.
Okay. Sorry. Go ahead, Stacey.
So I would jump in, and when I think about like the idea of defunding the police, and I actually hear a war cry of a community of people who have been deprived of their basic rights. And in the line of work that I do, education, I think a lot about our kids and like what the impact of policing is on them and their bodies and their lives. And so I think about the story that New Jersey is telling right now. In New Jersey, there are 119 children in youth prisons. 8 of those children are white. 119 children are in youth prisons, and 8 of those children are white children. And so we're talking about 111 Black and brown little boys and girls in youth prisons right now. And the state of New Jersey has argued that actually we're going to invest $500,000 to keep each of those kids there. And when pushed to actually lower the number of people in, or lower the number of children in youth prisons, or lower the amount of money that we're spending, New Jersey said, instead of lowering the amount that we're spending in the budget, we're actually going to increase the number of children, so we're spending less per children. And so the plan is actually to arrest more of our children. And when I think of defunding the police, it's more than just an attack on the police, right? It's actually the entire system. It's a system of justice in our country that is built on racial discrimination. And it impacts so much more. And as an educator, I think about what $500,000 in the life of each one of my kids, what that could do and what the difference is. So for me, I think about defunding the police as a larger issue and a bigger war cry.
And if I might add, when I think about defunding, I mean, I agree with what everyone else has stated too, but I also tend to think about the democratization of civility and social control. It would mean that each citizen would have a say in how they are governed, because I think that this is a must within a society that claims to be free and where we, the people, is supposed to have the last word, right? And how the government is constructed and how the government is executed, right? And when we think about how the government is executed, that also includes policing. So how this plays out in my own work as a critical criminologist, and I think about my own studies, and how I try to understand racialized social control and the implications. In my own work, I tend to use critical race theory a lot, to make sense of some of the things that you all have mentioned, my colleagues on the panel, like institutional racism and inequities, you know, and the connection between those realities and Black Americans, both historically and today. And so as I've navigated places like Ferguson, Baltimore, Newark, you know, and talking with community members, because a lot of my work is grounded in qualitative methodology, I see reoccurring themes of intentional neglect and exclusionary practices that relegates Blacks to a second caste status. So for me, for defunding, and again, going back to my earlier sentiments, it is the outright democratization of civility and social control, because the way in which policing functions now, that is the opposite of civility, right? Because Blacks at this moment do not have say in how policing is constructed and executed. So while, you know, the United States may claim that everybody has a voice, right, in how we are governed, the reality is throughout time and space, right, historically and today, that has not been the case for historically colonized and marginalized groups. And this is the case even after some of the so-called reforms, right? Because even after these reforms, unfortunately, these patterns have a way of reemerging.
Okay, now I have one question, because I've been speaking to a couple of people about this, and so when some people hear defund the police, they automatically hear or understand of no more police or part-time policing. How can you explain it to people in a way that they can grasp it, easier to understand, even for our youth, to understand what it really means to defund the police?
So when I think about how I can better explain that, I sort of think about, okay, how do you want to define safety first? You know, and I think there have been so many different ways to think about how safety has been framed in this country, because when I think about safety, I'm thinking about free from harm, free from risk, secure from danger. But we live in a society that has been organized and sustained by oppressive systems for hundreds of years. And so what happens when safety is defined by those who are unable to see the humanity in others, right? So I'm now going to ask you, you know, what type of world do you want to live in? In what world will you live in that everybody is safe? And what does it look like? What does it sound like? And how do we move towards that? And right now in the moment, you have to kind of acknowledge that people's fears about what a world without police might look like, but then that's when you offer them examples of how there are other cities and places who have developed other systems of interacting with one another to prevent violence from happening, right? And supporting people who may have, you know, been victims of police violence. These things are happening across cities in this country. And so I would just give them examples of what that looks like and tell them that, you know, let's build that work together. This is what we want to see happen, and it is going to require work to get done.
Yeah, I definitely would piggyback off of that and say that, you know, I think that the criminal punishment system in many ways has defined safety, like the way that people come to understand safety is through the lens of the criminal punishment system. And I think that, you know, as was said, I think an important piece of this is like rethinking how we even understand what safety is outside of a criminal legal sort of framework. You know, because when people don't have their basic needs met, like what does safety look like in that context, right? Like I think there's this sort of separating and sort of atomizing of like, okay, this is safety and this is, but like when we think around like well-being or what does it mean for people to be well and have the resources to thrive, I think it offers a more expansive way of understanding safety from harm, but also safety from economic precarity and safety from, you know, poor living conditions and poor building conditions. So, you know, I definitely think that like broadening out is really important. And something that I actually do with young people, you know, when I'm in conversation with them about this is ask like, you know, for every single situation that one can think of is like, what would an alternative system be, or what would an alternative approach be in that, you know, situation? And so if somebody is fighting, for example, like, well, who else can show up? Like, what would it look like? Like, what are the different things that can happen that don't look, you know, the way that it does? And I think oftentimes young people sometimes have these very imaginative ways of approaching these things because, you know, over time, the criminal legal system, again, it socializes us into thinking about how to understand safety and how to respond to it. And so Sometimes folks can be very imaginative, but you know, I think the main thing that I found useful is a part of like it's not about removing help. It's actually about creating systems that are able to actually provide help. And that the real way that, you know, the other pivot point that I usually go to is just that, you know, what does the system do now? Like, are we safe? Like, is there just like this broad safety? There's $100 billion going into policing, you know, a little around that going into prisons. Has that led to safety? And so when you look at it, it's like the system as it's currently configured doesn't lead, it doesn't do what people, what it's, you know, in many ways has convinced, or what the criminal legal system has convinced people of doing, it doesn't do that, you know, and so there clearly has to, you know, be a break point.
Okay, and so what do you think? What is one what is one misconception about defunding the police that you have gotten, and how would you respond to that misconception?
I think one that I've seen when I often hear about like defunding the police, the first one I hear is that we hate all police and that all police are bad, right? And I don't think that is what people mean when they say defund the police. What people are asking for is to actually reevaluate what is the role of police, right, in our communities. And I think we heard Taji talk about it, and we heard Philip talk about that idea of safety, right? And so who is actually the person in our community who's supposed to keep us safe, and who has the power in our communities to do that work? And so I think oftentimes we hear a lot of the instinct is anytime something goes wrong in our communities, that the police should show up, and that they should be the ones to de-escalate our people, to help or to save. And that's actually not the purpose of the police. They weren't created for that reason. And so they're never actually going to be able to do that work. And so we need, as a community, to reevaluate what actually is the role of the police, and who are the other people we need to activate to help keep us safe within our communities.
Okay, and to that, my question would be, say I ask you now, all right, so we're not sending police, let's say in someone in a distress or a domestic violence dispute. Who do we then send?
Yes, crisis intervention responders, mental health professionals, community activists, you know, credible messengers, people that are from the community, that know the community, that can be the pulse of the community, that can de-escalate violence, that can mediate situations, that can link people to resources. There are agencies around the country that are doing this, but we're just not getting the investment or the buy-in. A lot of philanthropic organizations are not looking to invest in us, right? So this is actually the optimal time. And I just want to put that out there because we have millions of dollars coming into our state right now. I think it's about $335 million coming in. Each county is getting millions, each city is getting millions, right, in New Jersey. And this is a great time where we can actually really have an exhaustive plan of what public safety should look like moving forward. And that is by investing in crisis intervention teams, right, mental health programs, thinking about all these young people that are going to go back to school. What are they going through, right? Really investing in a restorative justice course so that they're not pushed out of the system into that school to prison pipeline. Now, you know, they're cycled into the adult system, right? Creating long-term solutions for housing. Housing is a public health crisis in Paterson. You know, and I know right now, just because I'm working with some of these you know, families, and it's sad. Like, it's so hard for you to get any apartments that are affordable. I just saw, I think Black Lives Matter, you guys actually posted on, what was it, Governor Street, 1800 for an apartment. You know, they're pushing out the people that have historically lived there, right? So there's so many things that we can do with this new investment that is coming in, and we have to hold our stakeholders and our public officials accountable on how they're going to use this money. So yeah, and that money needs to be going into resources. And I'm not just pumping up my organization, right? I'm just saying any organization, whether it's Newark Community Street Team, whether it's, you know, you have the trauma recovery centers around the state, or you have all these mental health professionals, these grassroots organizations that have been doing the work anyways, right? Let's put the money into their hands because they have the pulse of the community. The community is not scared to go to them. They trust them. Let's build their infrastructure. Let's give them training, and let's invest in them because they're the ones who have the solutions, because they're the closest to the problem.
And if I may add, I think too, to add on to what Lisa was saying, the racial contours of this with regards, Lisa, to the investment, because we see this in some corners of the discourse, right? To add on to those misconceptions that, for instance, whites will lose power and authority over the socio-political governance of our society. And I think that in some way, this really puts in focus too the positionality of law enforcement, right? And what it has always meant to the broader sort of to the broader white community, historically in juxtaposition to minoritized communities. Like when we think about slavery, we got to think about what the slave patrols meant to the white community then, as far as how it upheld how the slave patrols, upheld slavery. And then also how law enforcement during Jim Crow upheld white supremacist segregationist policies. So we got to also foreground how law enforcement as an institution, right, has never really been neutral in its positionality within a society that has always been racialized and political in its social hierarchies and order. So when we think about this misconceptions on behalf of whites, well, many of them think that they might be actually losing an institution that frankly was never supposed to belong to them in the first place. So that, I think, is the biggest fear that is on the plate, if you will. But also when Lisa talks about these funds, well, listen, we pay taxes, right? Blacks pay taxes, and some of these other groups as well who have been disproportionately affected by police and state violence pay taxes. So these funds are owed to us, and some of us may even see it as a form of reparations, frankly.
So I also want to just push to that question. When we think about the numbers and the disparities, who do those other communities call, right? So we talk about, oh, what happens in Black communities or brown communities when you don't call the police? No, actually, what happens in white communities when they don't call the police? Is the argument that they don't have domestic violence disputes, or they don't have mental health issues, or that their children don't get into trouble? That's not the case, and we know that's not true. But something different happens in those communities when instances of violence or of a mental health issue comes up, where they step in and other community members step in on behalf of their people. And so in our community, we deserve that too. And so who are those people that we call? And I think, Lisa, you hit it right on the head, right? There are people in our communities right now. And you talked about like the North Street team. People are doing that work. They show up for the community. They know the kids. They know the family members. They know the community. And so when they show up, they're able to de-escalate because their design, they were intended and created to de-escalate situations of uncertainty in communities. And they weren't designed to incarcerate or to arrest or to incite more violence.
Okay, so I have two questions. One for Lisa, because you mentioned the funnel from school to prison, right? Can you explain that a little bit further for those who may not be aware of how that works and how it's actually a thing? Money is invested there?
Sure. So I'll give you two scenarios, right? So I had a young man, I had a restorative justice program in Newark. And this young man, he was some student that was kind of often ostracized, right? Mainly because he was smart. He wouldn't he wouldn't just let anybody just back him down, even if it's teachers, right? But he was very, still very, very respectful. One day, I think that they found marijuana in his locker, and what they automatically did was arrest him. And when the police came to the school, they automatically assumed he was a gang member. They called him a Crip. They said all this kind of stuff, labeled him, all that kind of stuff. Arrested him, took him out of school, and automatically they thought of expelling him and kicking him out of school and putting him in a school that could be potentially dangerous for him because it was going to be on the other side of town. And if you know anything about certain neighborhoods having beefs with each other, it could have been dangerous for him to even walk to that school. But this was the kind of plan that they had for him. However, he was involved in our program and we quickly got into action for advocacy. And I'm going to show you how we interrupted that pipeline, right? Because originally he was going to go to municipal court. He had just turned 18, just like 2 weeks, he turned 18, and now his life trajectory was going to change forever, right? Because now he's going to have a conviction. This was before marijuana was decriminalized and all those kind of things, right? He's going to have a criminal conviction, go to municipal court, and he was going to possibly placed on PTI or probation, be expelled from school in his senior year. And had we not advocated for him, he would have not have been brought into the restorative justice court. So in Newark, they have Newark, courts, community court solutions, right, where they have a restorative justice court. So we were able to bring him back in the juvenile justice system because we explained that he's a senior, right? Then he was able to just do community service, and that he never had a record. He was able to finish his high school career because we advocated for him in the school, right? He was able to graduate on time, and he went on to higher education. Now, I just want to give you that example of how different his life trajectory would have been had there not been an intervention program at that moment. Because the traditional course of action would have been, he would have went to adult court, had to pay, fines, and had a criminal conviction on his record. And in addition to that, he'd have to leave his school because he was expelled from there, and possibly drop out because he would have been going to a school that might have been dangerous for him, right? And then I just want you to think about the cycle that could have happened from that point on, right? And this is what we talk about with the school to prison pipeline. I'll give you another example really quick, because in the program that we work out of now, we have a young man that he grew up in the foster care system, right? Graduated, he ended up getting into made a decision that wasn't maybe the best decision, right? Because he had trauma and PTSD and all these kind of things that he incurred growing up in this foster care system. And he got into the juvenile justice system and went on into the adult system, right? And he could have gotten all this therapy and all these, advocacy systems put into his life early on, but he didn't. He came home from prison in his mid-20s, and he was shot 3 times in 1 year. Okay. Now, he entered our program, and we were able to now support him and advocate for him. And now he's doing okay, right? Where we've been able to relocate him and get him into a safer conditions. That's another example, right? Where this young man and many of our children, right? Think about all the trauma that they go through, and oftentimes schools don't understand or cannot meet their needs. They just don't have the investment in it, or they don't even know how to, right? And I don't blame teachers. I really don't. Because teachers are not trained in psychology, therapy, and all that kind of stuff. You have great teachers, but however, we have to build their capacity, right? And there's a lot of investment in socio-emotional learning and all that kind of stuff, but I think that there needs to be even more of an investment in culturally relevant mental health in the schools, kids about social justice and how to advocate for themselves, right? All these different things that will make them more confident and feel, see themselves as how important they are, right? And see themselves in the school education. So I think there's several layers to this. This is a huge passion of mine, because I see it every day, how important it is to intervene in those key moments in these young people's lives.
If I could just build on to Lisa, I think you brought up some amazing points just about like the culture of policing that takes place in schools. I've taught in elementary school and middle school, and I know we've all seen those videos of 5 and 6-year-olds being handcuffed, right? And like being placed in police cars. And it's crazy, right? And if you think about it, you now have children, 5 and 6-year-old children whose first interactions with the criminal justice system is in that type of manner, right? And so it's as children that our kids are being introduced to racism. When we think about it like that, these are 5 and 6-year-old kids. So what does that mean? How do we respond to their needs? And you mentioned like culturally responsive, like mental health. That's where I think culturally responsive pedagogy and culturally responsive school leadership plays a big role. You have leadership at the top who's aware of the circumstances, the situations, and are grounding school culture in these ideas. Then you have teacher training that now prepares teachers to interact in their classrooms in a way that they don't see a certain student's body language as potentially violent, and now I need to call security, and now the student needs to be removed from class, right? And so when we talk about investing or divesting from the police and defunding the police, I want to see more of that money being placed into schools in a way that's preparing teachers to interact with students in a way that is not leading to more harm, but is actually thinking about, is this policy going to decrease harm? Like, is this policy actually going to lead to more equitable situations in these schools that are currently happening, as opposed to what we're seeing right now? And so, I know sometimes for me, looking at defunding the police kind of happens through that lens of schools, because I'm seeing the kids, I'm hearing their stories, and I'm seeing how, in many ways, our society replicates what is happening on the outside inside of schools as this way of preparing students for the world outside of schools, but they're children, right? And so we need to interact with them as children and create these learning environments where they're not being over policed for their body language, their tone, and leading towards those suspensions, those expulsions. And now we have our students interacting with the criminal justice system in ways that did not need to happen.
Okay, and that's where I was going. That's the second part of my question. So when we talk about defunding the police, I think there's an opposite side to that, because how do we deal with now, let's say a child is placed in, let's say for JJC, the program at JJC. They come out, they may have to do fines, they may have to do probation. These are kids, these are children, or it's hard enough for us adults to get it together. So do you think that there, or what do you think, how do you think we can fix that in the court system side? Because that's a lot of pressure on a child to, they have to finish their school, do whatever probation they have, whatever program, and the fines at what, 16, 17 years old?
Well, if I may, there is a bill going through the legislature right now, the Restorative and Transformative Justice for Youth in Communities pilot program. I love my best friend Lisa's program. I hope that you can get some of this fuckers. Listen, you know, you are killing the game with that program. But what this bill attempts to do, and I got to give a shout out to the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. And of course, Zelly had a lot to do with this. He's involved with some of the things that goes on at the Institute as well, as far as the advocacy, the community-based advocacy parts of this. But they've been doing a lot to push this bill, to advocate for this bill. And what it basically does in a nutshell is turn a lot of the, if I might say, the social control mechanisms, right, over to the community. So, and one thing that I said on the earlier panel today is we got to stop sort of paternalizing communities and making it such that these communities can't take care of themselves and can't do anything for their youth, right? Because when we throw everything into the criminal justice system, criminal legal system, essentially what we're saying is, well, these communities are incompetent and they don't have what it takes to actually parent their youth, to restore their youth, so forth and so on. So one step we can do is actually educate our communities on what that bill is and push it as hard as we possibly can. This is another form of redistributing funds back into the community and away from policing, because policing is the entire system. So it's not just the traditional sort of uniform and cop with the badge and so forth and so on. It is the entire system. It's the system of corrections. It is prosecutorial discretion, right? So the DA offices, it is the entire system. It is SROs. I love what Taji had to say about the school system. It is school curriculums. The school curriculums is very punitive. We got to think about the psychic damage that these schools do day in, day out. I have not gotten rid of some of the psychic damages that the K through 12 system has done to me, right, as an adult male. So programs and bills such as these, I think, would help to shift some of that.
And
I think you're on mute. You're on mute.
okay, sorry. Okay, so what do you think is one thing we can do, or what we need to do, to stop the police force from killing Black people or others?
Yeah, I can talk to that, and I think it kind of ties into the other piece too. I think, you know, the only way to guarantee, you know, an encounter of police violence does not occur is to avoid the entire encounter altogether. Like that's the only way we can assure like that an incident of police violence, police murder, you know, police assault will not happen. And so I think, you know, principally it's about like working towards dramatically reducing the contact that police have with people. And I think that is the only way. It's a contact exposure perspective. If we think about it from a public health model, it's the only way we can guarantee that like the exposure does not occur. And so I think that that's why, you know, the investing in other kinds of systems, you know, to in other kinds of approaches and that's community based is critical, because the only way that you can guarantee is if someone with a badge and a gun doesn't show up, they can't shoot anybody. You know, so I think that there's a number of examples. You know, I think MH First has a really good example, a model of crisis intervention out in California. They've been doing a lot of great work, but I think, you know, and it ties into the question around courts too, which I appreciate, is like, how do you prevent carceral harm and harm from the courts is to do everything to avoid getting people in the court system to begin with. And I think there's these programs that are really important that center, trauma-informed perspectives and transformative justice, and models of safety and accountability that are not punitive, that are focused on repair and transformation. And I think building those up, but a part of it, of course, is that there's, the funding gaps, is there. There's also a piece just for big picture about Matthew Clare and Amanda Wu that came out recently called Courts in the Abolition Movement that discussed sort of thinking around sort of what abolition looks like in the context of the criminal courts. And the last thing I'll say is one of the really important things, and this kind of happened in New York City recently, is that the criminal punishment system, and police cannot practice, transformative justice. And I think that one of the real dangerous areas is that the criminal legal system will try to co-opt these approaches to now that the courts and the police are practicing, trauma-informed transformative justice, and that a system that like designed on punishment and vengeance cannot do that. And in many ways, it'll actually push us further away. And it's one of the ways in which these systems adapt and respond to moments of critique and moments of crisis over legitimacy is by co-opting the demands of people and trying to do it themselves. And I think it's really dangerous. So, I think, again, just to double back, the only way to avoid these encounters is to avoid them altogether, which is why I think that divesting from policing, systems of punishment, investing in these community resources, and the entire contact, of police with communities is key.
Okay, and wait, am I muted again? No. Okay. So I have a question, another question. I have a bunch of questions. What would we say to someone? There are a lot of Black and other minority police officers, right? And law enforcement. What would you say to them? Because they're feeling like, clearly I don't have the problem. I'm not racist. How would you explain that to them? Explain defunding the police and the whole idea to someone in a position of power, for lack of a better term.
I think that NYPD 12 is a perfect example of what you can do within the system, right? You have these Black and brown officers that stood up to the system, that said that they didn't want to be a part of the quotas. I'm a criminal justice professor. Most of my students want to become officers in BMCC CUNY, and I love my students, and all I can hope is that some of the knowledge that I give them will make them think about other job opportunities. But if they are going to be officers, then my hope is that they're critical, and then they understand not to proliferate the system that they're about to be a part of. But definitely for any Black and brown officers, I know that I have this conversation. I used to be a probation officer, so I used to wear a badge, right? And I think that was my frustration, being a part of a system that's built to work the way it works, right? I wasn't trying to, you couldn't really change anything, right? This is why I wanted to leave the system and try to do something else, because I wanted to build the community's capacity. I think that for those Black and brown officers that are kind of stuck in the system, and what they can do within there is go towards those high-ranking positions, right, and make those changes. Have the system invest into crisis intervention teams. There's models out there right now where we are. I'm not saying that that police should consistently be counted on, right, but there are models around the country where they're going out with social workers and officers, and the officers are trained in crisis intervention so that they don't pick up the gun, or they're not carrying weapons. They're actually going into these crisis situations in different ways. So on our path to abolition, where we are right now, because we have this system in place right now, I think it's so important for Black and brown officers to change the system while they're in it, whatever they can, and make sure that their voices are heard. And we see that happening right now with the NYPD 12. They are going through a lot, and they're suing the system, and they're not getting the backing they need to either, because they happen to be officers. So they're not getting the community's backing or the law enforcement backing, but they are speaking up about fighting within the system, against the system that proliferates these bias stop and frisk in New York City.
I would also say one of the biggest pieces when I've seen Black and brown officers really start to unpack some of that work is when they are present in their own communities, right? When they know who they are interacting with, who the kids are, who the family members are, who the struggling community members are. And so their engagement and their interactions with the people in those communities are completely different because they are a part of the community and they see themselves in it. The other piece that I would push on that topic is there's this understanding that because I'm Black or brown, I don't share in those biases, right? Like I don't carry any of that, or I haven't internalized any of the institutionalization that I've experienced. And as educators, we've been doing a lot of work in the recent years to unpack that as well, right? As an educator who has gone on to schools of higher learning, I come back to my own community with some biases that I continue to have to unpack, some work that I have to do. And so that is the work of everyone, right? Regardless of your position, you have to continuously do that work to unpack who you are and how your own experiences are influencing how you're seeing your community.
Yeah, and yeah, just around this piece too, I just want to like push like in certain directions because in many ways, like historically a part of the, especially coming out of the 60s, the way that, you know, during those moments of like crisis over policing, the way the system was able to preserve some sense of legitimacy is by incorporating like these sort of diversity community policing efforts, right? So this has been like decades long in the making. Like, let's get more Black and brown officers, let's do community policing. And continuously we see that, you know, police violence is rampant, and these efforts are, you know, usually like PR in essence, in that you can have Black people in all kinds of spaces, and that does not change these systems. So I just want to push back against the model, you know, that often people think that like if they're present and, you know, they're like from the community, quote unquote, that it will somehow, you know, transform these systems, because these systems have certain logics and practices and behaviors that supersede the efforts of individual or groups. And usually when people actually do try to really push back, usually they end up either leaving or they end up not being in that system anymore, because the ethos of the system overrides and it grinds out any sort of like, despite whatever best intention. So I think that is important, that often people end up getting, and this happens too a lot of times in communities, and it's a big thing that like sometimes people go into these pathways just as a way of social mobility because there's little other options. And so I think it's important to like to think about also how that is structuring, you know, people's paths, and also you know, but I just think it's important to really like to because sometimes people go into these systems thinking, oh, they're gonna, but at the core, people end up reinforcing the very things that they, you know, might say that they want to change because of the logics of the system itself.
If I can just add, I think in the case of the NYPD 12, with Officer Raymond's situation, I think he's risen to the rank of lieutenant. And the Crime and Punishment documentary, which is free for everyone to watch now on YouTube, is, I think, a must watch. I think you should watch it. Everyone who's watching this should watch it to get a really good depiction of their plight in terms of like how they were able to really work through those ranks. And really make change in a way, in their own little way. If I can add to this question though, qualified immunity. I think in New York, right? In New York City in particular, that has been like a real thing on the agenda over there. And now it's in the mayor's lap. If we can get that nationwide, that will be a plus. But we also got to go beyond that to the extent of termination. Because if I do something wrong at Montclair State, I knew I'm going to be gone, right? I'm going to be fired. And this, again, is part of democratizing government, because, again, I think sometimes we forget that policing is part of government. So just like we get to hold politicians accountable and the person who's over the water commission or whatever have you accountable, this same standard must be set for policing. And unfortunately, over time and space, a certain segment of society allowed this institution to exist beyond reproach because the negative adverse effects of this institution was not affecting that community. And so we got to get back to that. And termination when police officers mess up must become a key factor as well. So I hope that becomes part of policy discussions too.
Okay. So we're falling short. Clearly, we're falling short. There's something that we're missing as a community. What do you guys think? Where do you think we can invest more to uplift our community, to teach the youth, to teach even the adults that are the ones calling the police for the most minor things rather than speaking to your neighbor? Or because a lot of times that's what happens. You call the police because you don't like something rather than speaking to the neighbor and or whoever is out there. So yeah, I didn't get my question. So how do we, okay. So what are we doing? Where do you think we can invest more money? What programs?
I'm gonna put a plug in again because I need anybody that's listening to this, that there's money coming in with this American Rescue Plan. And if this is one of the best times to do a lot of organizing and activism work, make sure that the money goes to the community, not to anybody's raises, not to more money in the police force, not to things that don't matter. Right now, we have a great opportunity. For example, in Passaic County, we have $98 million coming to the county. We need to give them ideas, and that means really having whether it's focus groups of the community, right? The community is most impacted by COVID and violence right now. I'm having conversations with them like, what do you need? What do you want? How can we support you, right? And having them inform those policies instead of like us on that stakeholdership, like, oh, we're going to tell you what you need. This is a prime opportunity right now. I know for us with Paterson Healing Collective, we're doing that. We went out Friday night and we went to every neighborhood that we could think about that's going through a lot right now, a lot of trauma. And we're trying to change that narrative, right? That what you're going through is not normal. What we do now is anytime there's a person that gets shot, we go to that neighborhood and make sure we process it with them, right? It's not normal that you start a business again. It's not normal that somebody got shot right in this restaurant and you opened up the doors the next day. That's not normal. We cannot continue to do that. We have to process these things. We sit down with the kids and understand, teach them what trauma means. When you're not sleeping or when you're getting paranoid or all these kind of things that are happening, that's your brain telling you that something's wrong. That's your body telling you that something's wrong. And having these conversations, we've been doing that in our public safety roundtable every other Thursday, where we have community members speaking, having creating a safe space to actually talk about some of the issues that they're going through. I think right now is an optimal time where us as organizers, as community members, as people that care, have a great opportunity to really figure out where this money is going to go and make our stakeholders make sure that they put the money in the hands of the community and the agencies that have a pulse in the community, not to people that are going to tell you what they need. So let's just please make sure that everybody that's listening tonight, let's get on that board. I know I need your help in Passaic County because I don't want that money to go into the wrong hands. There's so many people that are hurting right now. We need to really come up with a great plan, and we have some ideas. If you want to come talk to us about some ideas, we got some great ideas, but even if it's not with us, team up with the grassroots agencies that's doing great work, like BLM Paterson, right? Then you have so many throughout Passaic County. Let's team up with them and make sure they get the funding and the infrastructure they need to have sustainability.
I'm just thinking about how do we get into our communities with our people and organize around, like you said, like really focusing and changing on people's material conditions, right? Like oftentimes the conversation always end up focusing on the crime that was committed as opposed to the conditions that led to behaviors that are then criminalized, right? Like when we talk about sex work, when we talk about desperation economies, people who may be, engaging in behaviors, as I said, who have been deemed as criminalized. Like if we're not going to the root of the problem, then we can continue putting band-aids on and trying to put caulks in this like Grand Canyon of issues. But if white supremacy, if systemic racism, if these things are not named, if these things are not addressed, then what happens is they're allowed to reproduce, they're allowed to sustain themselves. And then we come into this cycle again of these conversations of what do we do next? And so I'm really thinking about, as many people have named here, that process of abolition. What does that look like? And how does defunding the police actually lead to us collectively creating these societies and these communities where everybody has their needs met? Because we know research shows in different communities across the country where people's needs are being met, you tend to see lower levels of crime. And so if we can turn our focus there and start thinking about how to invest in those things, then I think we can start to see some changes happening. Of course, over time, but we can definitely start doing that work.
Okay. So now we are going to open it up for any questions that anyone on Facebook may have. Y'all feel free to drop in your questions for our panelists. What questions do you have? How do we implement that in Passaic County? No, that's my question to you guys. How do we implement that in Passaic County? Am I muted? Was I muted?
No.
No, you're loud and clear.
You were asking us. I thought you were asking the Facebook what people that were watching. Oh, to us. Okay. Well, I already told y'all. I need y'all to help me a lot. We need this money. I mean, we so far serviced 45 gunshot victims in the city of Paterson since October to right now March 29th. And this is a voluntary program where they just come to us. Since January, there's already been 30 gunshot victims. 5 people have already unfortunately passed on. We have so many things that we need to do. Our program, unfortunately, only works with people that it's a reactive program, unfortunately, because it's an intervention program. It's after they get shot. So we need more investment in prevention, right, to stop the school to prison pipeline, to make sure that we have, early childhood programs and all that kind of stuff. So right now, like I said, that American Rescue Plan has mental health, crisis intervention, housing written all in the language. So we can definitely use that money right now to build some sustainability and great options for our city. So how I need y'all help, whoever's watching right now, is we have the Public Safety Roundtable this Thursday. We have some proposals that are coming up. We need y'all to sign these proposals. I'm gonna push my brother Zelly, like, come on, man, we gotta get on. Zelly and I already been talking about, let's have block parties all weekend, every day in the summer, so that these kids are busy and we have some healing for them and all that kind of stuff. So we need your support in Paterson, because we're hurting. It's a public health crisis. We cannot lock up our problem away. That's what's happening, and it's not solving anything. So let's please support grassroots community-based agencies like ours.
Okay, so we have 2 questions from Facebook. One, Jose, he asked, I just wonder why it's so hard to enact legislation, whether on a state or local level, to hold police accountable. Not every officer is a bad cop. And then second, we have, how are the panelists, so how are you guys, partnering up with other educators, school groups, or I guess other organizations to push this message out collectively?
I would say with the politicians, it's the lack of political will most of the time. But in this current era or moment, if you will, they've been forced to have to act to a large degree because of the large scale advocacy and let's just say it, what has been happening, unfortunately. So there is this sense, so to speak, of them not being able to sort of sweep it under the rug, if you will. But we got to keep pushing. Right. You can't just, so for instance, we can't allow them to come out and give a quick feel good speech and say that they're going to do something. And then we all just go home and, hope that, off the strength of the speech that they're then going to do something. And then also you're fighting against the politicization of law enforcement itself through the use of unions. So those unions are very powerful as well. But that doesn't mean that we people can't prevail in the end, because like I've been mentioning all along, we have to take back our government in that sense, right? Because police officers and police in itself is a part of the government, and the government is accountable to we the people, and that also includes Black and brown people and other minoritized individuals.
Yeah, I would just say to that first question that, I think it would be useful to just look into sort of like the history of policing. I think there's a lot of different resources. I think Alex Fatale's The End of Policing is one resource. I think Abolition for the People that recently came out has a lot of good resources. That's on Levels, a collab with Kaepernick Publishing. But, I think when you look into the history, just at its core, policing is centered on racial and class control and, and punishment and vengeance. And so I think you know, that it's so baked into the design of it that like these attempts, I mean, there's laws passed all the time, you know, laws will be passed during this cycle because of the uprisings. But it won't, you know, they won't stop police violence from happening. And it's actually, and it's to your point, Jose, it's not about like individual police officers being bad or not. It's that the system is at its core, you know, bad and illegitimate, and at its core is focused on control and punishment. And so it would only be able to produce that, you know, in that the focus even on individuals through prosecuting or otherwise, you know, it's actually not it's the entire systems that produce these outcomes. You know, I think that's what the thrust of the abolition movement is about, is that it's the entire systems. And so dismantling them and building new, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, you know, life affirming institutions is key for creating, you know, a different kind of society and world. But yeah.
I would also add, I think when we think about the system in itself, right, it is $1 billion industry, and those dollars are landing somewhere. And so legislators are going to push back, right? Because people are profiting off of the entire justice system. And so when you talk about defunding, you're also talking about challenging people's jobs. And so people are going to fight to protect them. And so instead of the incentive being to create safe communities, the actual incentive is on protecting those dollars and where they land. And so we really just need to continue to hold our people accountable and to demand that our votes count and they matter, and that we're only voting and supporting people who actually have our true interests at heart too. And we're supporting the bills and the organizations who are doing the work. And so we fight for where our dollars land. So that's to the first question. And I think to the second question around like partnering with organizations and PTOs, I think as an educator, that is something that is near and dear to my heart. In our schools, we are constantly asking our families for what do they need, right? And we're seeing our kids who are struggling in different capacities and our families who are struggling in different capacities. And so figuring out how do we get the supports that they need. It does mean supporting your school organizations or your parent organizations. It means actually making sure that parents have a voice and communities have a voice so they can come into the schools and share feedback about systems that aren't happening for them.
I'll start with the second question. In terms of what's happening on the ground, I've actually started working with Black Lives Matter Paterson. Following them on Instagram, just seeing what they were doing in the community in Paterson motivated me. I mean, I've been looking for an organization who I feel like is on the ground with the people. And I mean, I'm seeing Zelly every Friday out here doing mutual aid work. And it's just, you know, I feel like that's the first step, is finding an organization and joining an organization. And as an educator, just bouncing off of Stacy, within the school system, you have to find moments to interrupt and disrupt when those conversations are happening that aren't rooted in our kids, that aren't rooted in our communities, and naming what's happening and talking with other teachers. You know, those conversations can be awkward at first. You know, you're now, again, like you're critiquing a system that has, for many people, seem to be the norm and has been an acceptable way of simply just being, whether that be in a police officer, prosecutor, educator. And so just knowing that when you're having these conversations, you are doing so with the intention of changing what is happening, making sure that it's kids first, communities first, and if not, then we need to come back to the drawing board and we need to ask ourselves some more critical questions.
What other things are you guys doing in the community?
Lots of things such as these, you know, so me as a researcher, bringing my research too and my advocacy into the community. So sometimes, you know, as they say with the ivory tower, we tend to keep a lot of what we do in the ivory tower. So I'm constantly trying to create new publics and avenues between the community, especially, you know, disempowered communities into the university. And especially on a lot of these particular issues. So that's one thing that I try to do, but also, like I said, through my activism, being in the community, pushing on a lot of these issues and working with various community groups, you know, to push new policies. So like I mentioned with the pilot program that I mentioned earlier that I hope, and I'm just gonna say at least this group get, hoping to push new policies to change this system.
Okay. So what would your advice be to someone who is, let's say, a 16-year-old who finds himself in a legal, let's say, a probation? Lisa, you said you were a probation officer, right? So who finds themselves in some kind of system already, how would you tell them, or how would you be able to help them to get out of it?
So we do that right now because some of our survivors are justice involved. So what we do is advocacy. So one of the good things, I guess, from working in the system is that I know a lot of people in the system now, and I use some of that nepotism. I'm sorry, but it's a good way for me to use some of the context because I've built some social capital right in Passaic County now. But other than that, just advocacy work that we do. Like, people don't know that it's sometimes a simple letter that you write to the municipal court. There's so many warrants, right, for little things that maybe people forgot the court date. There's little small offenses that make your license get suspended. So what we do as an agency is write those letters for our community members and make sure that they get those warrants taken care of, right? So that doesn't hold them up on continuing their life. We also make sure that, if they have any issues with driving or getting an ID, we try to make sure that they get those things taken care of so we can use some of our contacts and our social capital within the system to do that advocacy. As far as those that are currently in the system, how do they get out of it? Like I said, a lot of it is, I'm going to say again, investing in community-based resources that can do the advocacy for them and do case management. And those people that I hire what's called credible messengers. These are people that are justice involved that have transformed their lives or have been impacted by violence themselves. And, they know how to have coping skills, right, that they can give to some of our participants to make sure that, when they're frustrated, as it will be, right, being having to deal with a probation officer, parole officer. I know that I've called several probation, parole, and the administration to kind of advocate on behalf of our participants, because sometimes the system, we know the system is not trauma informed, right? That if a person is dealing with this kind of trauma, we need to have a different understanding of why they might not be showing up. It's not that they might not just, it's just life is happening, you know what I mean? And if they're coming to us, why don't you let us be that midway agency that can, make sure that this person is doing, getting supported the way they needed to. And we can kind of be that middle ground where hopefully that this person can get out of the system. I mean, I've worked in probation, I know how hard it is, you know what I mean? Meaning for our participants, for the people that are navigating that, because you feel like you're not free, right? You're in the community and it's confusing, but you have a curfew and it's like, I can't hang out with my friends. It's a very confusing type of situation. So, it's almost like a trap. We know that technical violations are a huge reason why people go back into the system. So I think that we need to do things about making sure that those technical violations don't continue to be the reason why people go into prison either, right? So we have to do some work on that as well.
Okay, so we have another question that says, how do we stop our Black and brown brothers and sisters from being locked up for little offenses?
I wish that there were more attention to the station house adjustments with the juvenile, at the juvenile justice level. So, because I think, speak a lot about adults, right? But we don't talk too much about, and I like that Taji's been focusing a lot of his commentary on schools and stuff like that. But there were also, in some of the reports that came out of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, the disparities amongst the youth with regards to the station house adjustment. So how white youth are more likely to be let go under this statute than youth of color, right? And so this, to me, speaks to the absolute necessity for us to go to, and I know they changed, I think they're now called county commissioners, no longer the board of chosen freeholders. But this means that we need to now go to some of those meetings, hold them accountable as far as who they are appointing to the JCC county level commissions.
Yeah, I'll also add that, I think similar to the other discussion, is really investing in community resources and institutions to, one, make sure people have the basic needs met, but also make sure that people have systems of safety and also responses to trauma and violence and harm that are rooted in repair and transformation and not vengeance and control. And I think in building that capacity up, in creating a context yeah, where everything is not solved through police and prisons is key. But I think, I also want to push a little bit further. Like, there's a really good book that I would recommend, who the person who asked this question, and everybody who's interested. It's called Until We Reckon, that talks about, like, sometimes there gets this dichotomy between like little offenses and bigger offenses, or violent and nonviolent, and that, like, prisons and police are fine as long as it's in certain contexts. And I think, even when you look statistically, when we think about mass incarceration, even if you let everyone out that who's convicted of a nonviolent, quote unquote, little offense, it wouldn't end mass incarceration, right? And so there's this piece here that we have to start, and there's folks who do. I think Paterson Healing Collective is definitely a great example. And there's a number of folks who in community intervention teams, violence intervention teams that respond to trauma and violence and harm, not with a gun and, a jail cell and a badge, but with like a trauma-informed, transformative justice approach. And I think that it's not just the little offenses, it's really a reimagining of how we're thinking about safety and responding to harm and conflict and violence when it does happen. That does not look like the current model of punishment and control.
Okay, now I have a question, because Lisa, you touched up on this, where you said they get violated, right? And you go back into the system. So what about when someone is, let's say a youth, you can now live with felons, or you can't be by felons, and my whole family's a felon and I live here? How would you be able to help someone in a situation like that? Because there's a lot of people that may be watching this live, youths, and they find themselves in a situation, they're on some kind of program, and one of the stipulations is you can't live with felons or be around felons, and like, that's my whole family. And then my second part is, I'm not sure which one of you guys mentioned that about hiring people in the community. So do you think maybe if police officers were required to be part of the community that they police, like Paterson police has to live in Paterson, Passaic police has to live in Passaic, do you think that would be helpful?
I'm gonna jump in quickly and say, I think there's examples where that happens. That doesn't stop police violence or police like harm. That'll be my response.
That first question about those that are that have that issue where, like, say people are in their families that might be justice involved as well, and we gotta just change those policies. There's no way around it. They're stupid, because I'm not gonna tell you not to be with your cousin or your family member, or your mother or your father, and we know the system is biased, and we know that there's some communities that just get trapped into the system because of the way it's policed, right? Because if you live in a suburb, there's not police on every corner that's gonna ticket you or pull you over or anything like that. So it just sometimes is the way that certain communities are policed. That's why there's so many, like, there's certain blocks that are literally generational. You have generations of people that are consistently getting trapped in the system. So for that question, I think there needs to be more advocacy around that. I know when I was a PO, I thought that was the silliest thing, like, and I never, I would never enforce something like that, because it doesn't make any sense, right? And I think that you can't have any gang involvement. You know how they have those stipulations where you can't be affiliated with any gang members. I think there's a lot of education that has to be done around what we call gangs and who we call gang members, right? We assume Black and brown young men and women are gang members just because they live on a certain block, right? And also giving the information about what's the difference between being active and people can be affiliated, and it's not a crime, right? It's not illegal to be affiliated with a certain street organization, and we need to have more education about that. So I think that really those policies on those stipulations and probation, like the standard conditions of probation, need to be be done away with, right? And then the second piece is to have more education, because a lot of those type of things are those gang related stigmas like people have about, even the word gang kind of annoys me, but we know that there's a lot of policies, or the way that it's policed is really strict, right? Because they're demonized and they're always ostracized because they're considered extremely violent and all these kind of things, right? But we know that if this was we know that throughout the history of this country that a lot of different groups were a part of these street organizations, right? It just transgressed when new ethnicities, moved into the same location. So we need to have more education around that kind of stigma that's affiliated with that. And for the police question, I don't think that it really matters. I think the system, right? It has to come from the higher up down. Like if you have a system that's already infiltrated with, because you have some neighbor, look at Newark Police, right? When they had the, what is that called, Jason? I'm sorry, I was consent decree, right? Newark, most of the officers were Black and brown from Newark. That didn't stop, human rights violations from happening. So it has to be a structural change. It has to be a cultural change. It has to come from top to bottom. People have to be held accountable. That's it. There's too many things that are people are getting away with.
And I will say in my own ethnographic research in Baltimore, a lot of my Black participants felt that the Black cops were worse than the white cops. And they had that same type of initiative where they wanted most of the cops to come from Baltimore, right? And I think much of that is based too on like, look, the economic benefits of becoming an officer needs to first be given to people from here. And so to some extent, I can kind of see that. But again, like Philip and Lisa is saying, the institution is the institution. So after a while, you're going to be brought into a process of socialization that might strip away, right, what you thought you were getting into. But that isn't going to be the case for like everybody that go into it, because again, Officer Raymond from the NYPD 12 and his colleagues.
Okay, and how can we address and help change the narrative that people in our community just want to live this way and that's just who we are in a negative way?
So I started thinking about that question earlier, and I think one of the pieces that happens frequently is that our people don't actually get a chance to share their voices and their stories, right? The story is being told for them and for us. And so as often as we can give people or empower people to tell their own stories, teaching our kids in schools there to embody who they are and to make decisions for themselves and to share that and to speak their truth, I think is extremely valuable. We get to decide who we are, what our narrative is, and then we get to speak about it. And instead of allowing other people to continuously decide what our narrative is.
You're on mute, Bree.
I just realized, sorry. Do we have any more questions on Facebook Live? Nope, I can't see. Okay, all right, so now we're gonna give each panelist a minute to just speak your mind, what you want the audience, anyone that may be watching this later on a replay, what you want them to leave from this panel.
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I think,
Sorry, I should have done that.
No, it's all good. I think, the main thing, like what I mentioned earlier, is that, police violence has been a feature of this country since, policing began, specifically as a form of, control for enslaved people. And then, in other places, as a form of labor control. So I think, like, importantly, it's just that, like, if we want to stop police violence, we just have to begin to, like, dramatically reducing and in my vision, eventually abolishing, like, policing, but the process of dramatically reducing policing and police contact with people. So I think that that's important. I think the other part, just to tie back into the question around, like, Black and brown officers, there's a piece by Bree Newsome that's in Level, the Abolition for the People series, and the subtitle is Black Cops Don't Make Policing Any Less Anti-Black. And so I think that that's important, because I think, again, as I mentioned, like, these diversity efforts in community policing are often positioned as solutions to police violence and terror. And it's been the case since specifically coming out of the 70s, in the decades following that. These efforts, when you hear them, they sound, they seem to sound good, but, like, it has continuously created a context where it has made policing and the criminal punishment system more permanent. And, it hasn't stopped police violence, and I think it was mentioned there's places where there's, a large number of Black and brown police officers, and they're still rampant police violence, that the system at its core is anti-Black and a form of racial and class control, and that putting people of different races or backgrounds in these positions, it doesn't stop the violence from happening. So I think that's definitely key. And I think the other piece is that lastly is around building up that all of this defunding abolition is not about just this the absence. It's about presence, and it's more about presence, but the absence is in getting and chipping away and moving something is a way to build something else that's more life affirming, that's more just, it's more equitable, and that can give people the resources and conditions that they need to be safe and to thrive. That's it. That's my piece.
Who's going next?
I'll go really quick. So what I hope that everybody got out of this panel is that we're at a pivotal moment where we can redefine what public safety means, and doesn't always have to lean on the police. And I think all of us on this panel, we've shared the same point of view that we need to invest in our community and build their capacity. So let's try to move, create movements around that. Me being local, please follow us with Paterson Healing Collective with the movement we're trying to do, because we're trying to utilize the public health model to look at violence, because violence is usually how we get more policing, right? Because you just scare the community and say, oh, well, do you look at all this violence that's happening? So we're trying to create a different narrative around violence where, violence is really related to trauma, mental health services, and crisis management. So I think that right now, all of us that are watching, we need to organize around how this money, and I'm going to bring it back up, all right? I'm going to keep saying it. It's American Rescue Plan money that's coming down the pipeline, guys. We need to organize around it and make sure it gets to these grassroots agencies so we can really service our communities, because this pandemic has hit us the hardest. When I say that, our working class communities, our Black and brown communities, our immigrant communities, it has hit us the hardest. We deserve this money to create some longevity and sustainability for us so that we don't continue to go through these crises constantly. All right, so please, follow us on Paterson Healing Collective and Reimagining Justice. We're here to stay, and we're trying to build our capacity and bring other community members along with us to make sure that we don't see violence anymore, right? And we see safety within the lens of the community.
I'll just say, right now, like Lisa said earlier, the people closest to the problem know what needs to happen. So start talking to the people in your communities right now, talking about what ways you're already keeping each other safe, what ways you can continue to build on, and go from there. And trust yourselves, know that it won't be easy, but talk with the people around you, start in your community, and just trust yourselves, trust the process.
And where do I begin? I will say that policing is part and parcel, because I agree with what everyone is saying, but it's part and parcel of how our society is constructed. And like I mentioned earlier, it goes way beyond the badge and the uniform. But even as we work towards the abolition of oppressive systems, to which I agree, we're working on an edited volume now on abolishing criminology and all of these carceral systems. We can simultaneously give credence to these sort of micro-contextual realities in which some are actually able to be divergent within these systems. So for instance, I'm going back to Officer Raymond, right? So for how some of these officers can join the police force and absolutely refuse to participate in quotas. Right, despite their participation in structures that are still oppressive and anti-Black. I think we can still value and think in these very deeply nuanced ways at the same time while being abolitionists as well, right? We can fight these battles on multiple levels, if you will. But aside from that, I think too that advocacy towards community-based restoration is a must. That is the only way in which we can democratize this system and make sure that Black lives matters and other marginalized groups as well.
And I think for me, I would be remiss if I as an educator, miss the opportunity to talk about being proactive, right? And so the work that we do right now matters for our kids. And so as often as we can, we educate our kids on who what the system is, the realities of the system, and preventing them from being entangled with the system as often as possible is so important. And so invest in your local community organizations. It's so beautiful to hear the work that you're doing, Lisa, in the community. And so many other organizations. We heard about the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, the Newark Community Street Team. People are doing the work, so invest in them. Support the work that they're doing and get in front of it for our kids so that they don't become entangled in the system as well.
I can never find this dang mute button. All right, guys. So I just want to thank you all for coming on here tonight. I appreciate it. We all appreciate it. We appreciate the work that you guys do. Thank you for educating the community. So yes, I want to thank you all. And I want to just, everyone that is watching or anyone who may be watching this later, I urge you to get involved somehow. You have BLM Paterson, you have our tag, which for Instagram, the IG handle, which is BLM Paterson, the Paterson Healing Collective, Reimagine Injustice, Lisa Chow, all with the @ right? And at RJLIZAC. So if you want to just follow everyone, over at BLM Paterson, we have every Friday night, we have the Everybody Eats thing going on, where we bring out food, warm meals, clothes, whatever we can to the community. So definitely get involved. Also, there's links in that bio where you can donate, you can sign up for different events, you can join the Street Medic team. So yeah, that's what we're doing. I just want to thank everyone. And I think that's how we close it off. Is that what we're doing? Yeah? Okay, I think so.